Hey everybody, welcome back. For everybody who's been following my work in the last week and a half, 2 weeks or so, you'll probably be familiar at this point that we have been building on the original Earth grid network work that the Florida Maquis has been doing. And another shout out to him for going back and recolor coding all of the Earth grid network on his channel's FMV file that he's been supplying to everybody, to continue to find the pentagonal structures, of which he just found another one the other day right here, actually yesterday I think, down in Antarctica, and he's been finding these all over the place. And so those who have also come to this video and may be familiar with the channel, you'll remember that we've been talking about his findings on the Earth grid network in this graphic here, which should be all too familiar to you. If it's not, I would recommend going back to my previous videos and going back and looking at how we are tying in the work of Buckminster Fuller and his buckyball for structure that he discovered into an expanding Earth model, and at least partially explaining what's going on the Earth's ley lines and Earth's grid network. Somehow the pentagonal structures are related, as we see here. It's sacred geometry, even on the buckyball. You get hexagons and pentagons interlocking with one another to make what is a complete sacred geometrical structure. And you zoom in on this, you see it's a fractal pattern. So they get infinitesimally small, and this also would explain what we're finding in the effect of these incredibly small networks here. To tie in a little bit of a concept from what I'm supposing is also happening just in terms of an electromagnetic anomaly along these expansion joints, I point you back to these types of incidents where UFOs land and leave electromagnetic anomalies in their wake, where they had presumably stood. And of course, I'm not claiming anything with any of these. It is quite curious that crop circles and points like this that come down in the forest, especially this cases in the Pacific Northwest that have been heard about, and that the original X-Files episodes were created based off of, all kind of corroborate these types of electromagnetic anomalies that get left down where vegetation doesn't grow. So what we're getting is undoubtedly, in my mind, from the work of Samuel Warren Carey coupled with Buckminster Fuller, we're getting an expansion of the Earth's nodal joints, let's call them, and the plate tectonics of the Earth are separating, and we're getting particularly active spots at these nodes. I think it's an auspicious time for us, and we're going to tie in some of the concepts that I promised to last time with the ley line network and explaining why then we put sacred structures on them, either monolithic or architecturally significant structures along these lines. And we posited the question at the end of last video as why temples in specific would be on there. And so we're going to go into a little bit more of that concept today too. And so before we get into that, I want to face a full disclosure. I make no claim that this is the only thing that these energy points are used for. In fact, Florida Maquis has talked about how they're used potentially for Stargate networks, which I totally stand behind the hypothesis there. I think he's actually found good representation of one, in fact, down in Antarctica. But if these energy lines are as powerful and as versatile as I think the ancients knew they were probably used for a whole host of different things. And we're going to go into today, as we're going to go into speaking of them being used for communications, them being used for a higher consciousness, a higher connectivity to the universe therein, and of course maybe as points of measurement as a third. And we're going to go into the work of Joseph Farrell again, and we're then going to go into the book of Lost Star and Myth and Time by Walter Cruttenden. But to answer the question of the temples, we're going to first start off there and start with some science. And worth mentioning as well, Joseph Farrell's work, he just wrote a new blog today, his website, Giza Death Star, that ties in some more of the curious explosions in Russia to a biotech lab that was host to Ebola testing. So I'll let you guys go there and read his blog. We're not going to go into it, but since we're going to go into his work here, I might as well let the whole audience know that that's going to be something worth looking into, I'm sure. But anyway, going into why these temples were placed along these ley lines. And to give you a little bit of background here, we're going to go through this. We're going to start on chapter 74 of his book, Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, and talk about the subheadings within the chapter. And I'm going to briefly summarize what that chapter's about before kind of explaining the evidence that these temples were used for something beyond what they were purported to, and goes into the speculation as to the why they may be placed on ley lines. And I'll just bring this graphic back up as well, because I promised we would get back to this in the last video. Of course, this is Ireland. We are going to round ourselves back around to this in the Lost Star Myth and Time work. Anyway, and this is a particularly prescient graphic, I think, just based on the fact that the Florida Maquis has been finding Norse images and Norse imagery in his work, both in Antarctica and up in the northern grid networks. I thought it was pretty funny, since Nikola Tesla seems to be kind of a mainstay of this channel thus far. This is just a graphic I've always loved, and it is actually the graphic of the channel itself with Thor's hammer and such. So anyway, back to getting to the work. Sorry for that detour. What Joseph Farrell has started to get into in this book, which is a sequel of sorts to Babylon's Banksters, which we went into last time, is he's starting to get into referencing the mind manipulation that happens with an ancient type of technology, which he posits is the temples themselves. And he goes into these different subheadings, or one, the alien abduction scenario and the moral disconnect, as these incredibly consistent accounts of people going through such seem to state. Number two, the false dialectic, Occam's razor, and their implications. And this, of course, goes into parsimony and the most logical explanation based on a lot of different accounts, all reaching the same conclusion. And again, these accounts are of people of these times experiencing these curious things happening around these temples. Number three, the electronic methods of mind manipulation. And this, of course, this section refers to a lot of what we've already come to, well, even in the popular science these days with Stranger Things and things like this, the ESP, PSYOPs, deep state, CIA programs into mind manipulation has become mainstay. And so this goes a little bit more of the microwave induction and delivery methodology of that. It then goes into creating electromagnetic fields and remote viewing as a subtopic, which, of course, we discussed last time a little bit when I referred everybody over to the crypto viewing work and the Grand Canyon and how it factors into Rotorua. But it's interesting that it's mentioned here alongside temples. Electronic dissolution of memory, missing time and history. So this goes into the inference that using frequency and somehow around these temples, people had experienced electronic dissolution of memory, potentially missing their memories of sorts, right? The abduction scenarios, and then beat frequencies in the brain, beat frequencies out of body experiences, remote induction of trances and emotions, and telepathy. In other words, it culminates into a section summary, which I guess I'm going to read verbatim to you so you can get all the points wrapped up into exactly where we're going here. At the end of the excursion into the modern mind manipulation techniques and technologies, what do we have? A short review reveals the apologetic implications for the accounts alleged of special revelations in ancient times. If such a technology is assumed to have existed and to have been used in ancient times, for by relatively simple means, the modern techniques and technologies can remotely include 1. Emotional states of all sorts, from euphoria, anger, hypnogenic suggestibility, trance, and so on. Actual perception of visions and voices with specific information of instruction. Post-hypnotic suggestibility, out-of-body experiences, induction of false memories, missing time, and thus missing history in false interpretive contexts. The only question now is there any evidence that such technologies, however primitive, might have existed in ancient times? And if there had existed elites or elites with agendas to manipulate mankind into the earliest stages of civilization, as was argued in the previous chapter, is there any evidence to suggest that these technologies were employed to manipulate the most socially cohesive force in human history, religion itself? And Joseph Farrell adds the commentary, the answer sadly is yes. So pausing right there, what he's saying is, just as we were going through, and he was building the case for earlier in the chapter, there's some sort of technology being inflicted on the people. There's vast amounts of historical data that you can break apart, I guess, is the best way you can describe that within the texts. The texts that he himself, in fact, is laboriously cited in every single one of his books where he gets these inferences from. And of course, one has to use the concept of parsimony and Occam's razor to really look at, well, what are all of these things drawing the conclusion of? Well, there's something in the middle, something clearly causing some of this stuff to happen. And the least common denominator is those temples. And as he was stating in Babylon's Banksters, potentially there's something going on with the enslavement of people with money, how it ties to religion, and subjugating people with both. And this goes into the kind of maniacal way in which they themselves, with these temples anyway, are using these ley lines. I'll continue a little bit further on to this before we move on to a couple other topics, but he adds some other context here to tie it together. Torsion, temples of antiquity, a primitive technology of communication, and special revelation, it reads for section C of this chapter, page 87 of Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. In seeking to answer the question of whether or not such mind manipulation technologies existed and that they were used in ancient times to manipulate religion itself as a socially cohesive force, our attention must be focused once again on texts, with the understanding that, in a certain sense, monuments and structures themselves are texts, to be understood and properly decoded by the requisite physics and engineering principles. Additionally, of course, we shall have to contend with actual written texts and what they portend in this regard. In my previous book, Babylon's Banksters, he writes, The Alchemy of Deep Physics, High Finance, and Ancient Religion, I argued for the existence of globally extended financial elite that have attached itself to the temples and priesthoods of antiquity for the purpose of installing a financial monopoly over the private issuance of monetized debt, and for the purpose of manipulating the bullion policies of various empires. As a consequence of this conclusion, I also argued that such manipulation would have required, then as now, a secure means of rapid communication between vast distances. Let me say that again. It required a secure means of rapid communication between vast distances. That in turn would have required the existence of a hidden technology, or at the minimum, a technology that was not genuinely appreciated as such by modern interpreters. So what he's saying there is that within the parsimony of our critical thinking here, at least, we can probably find that the interpreters of ancient texts, and of course the monoliths that sit along these ley lines being texts themselves that have a common thread, he's suggesting that our interpretation in the history books is either out of perspective, askew, false entirely, or hidden, and purposefully done so. And it could be a combination of all these things, but either way, I agree with his assessment that we're missing something here, and there's something at the heart of all this. And as he concludes, that very communication device very well could be the temples. I'm going to continue. Fortunately, I did not have to look long nor far to find an engineer who had tackled precisely this problem, and who had made an amazing discovery, namely that the technology was the ancient temples themselves, and moreover, that the technology was a scalar electromagnetic technology. In short, a radio technology, he writes. They're dealing with radio frequencies and waves, in other words, in these ancient times, using somehow the temples. I'll continue here. The engineer was a German professor of engineering, Professor Dr. Konstantin Mail, and Mail spelled M-E-Y-L, actually. In fact, just as this is the book that Dr. Farrell is referencing here, and it goes into, at some point, the structures of the DNA, it goes into the expanding Earth model, and it goes into the ley line structure of the Earth, and how, and there's even a section in here that measures the cavities of the temples he's talking about. This book in particular is a must-read. It's really thick, really, really hard to digest, but it does tie all these concepts together a little bit deeper if you want to expand your mind a little bit after this concept is introduced. Anyway, Dr. Konstantin Mail in his research was nothing less than stunning and sweeping in its implications. How else, he asked, could one make sense of some statements in classical texts that Roman Empire functionaries in distant regions of the empire would send to the emperor, quote unquote? He uses this phrase, send to the emperor, for instructions, and receive an answer at the latest the following night. Miles' answer simply is that there was a technology in play, religious temples, as we're talking about here. Even he suspects. Miles states the case that the ancient temples were actually sophisticated radio transmitters by posing the classic engineer's optimization problem. And here's where it really meets the road, guys, because here's where we're talking about the parsimony being the case with the simplest explanation, because of all of the evidence pointing to it likely being the one that we're discussing. And he goes on here without getting too far into the weeds. He's talking about specific frequencies being used in the temples. He says he should build a transmitter with a maximum range at minimum transmitting power, thus a classic of optimization. Doing so, the material expenditure doesn't play a role. And so he's talking about not having to have an antenna of a classical sense because the material doesn't explain a role, but rather get down to the Parthenon, all of the temples that are in ancient times have these very measurable, very exact Hertzian frequencies. And based on the resonance of the cavity that they're in, he essentially prescribes that you can pinpoint where these things are at because of the dimensions where they're at. I'm guessing use the longitudinal structure of the ley lines somehow to transmit it, because again, as he's saying, these messages are being transmitted to Roman dignitaries within one night of each other from across the land. There's no mercenary, no marathon runner that's going to be able to take your message that quickly, that far. So anyway, it's a very fascinating topic. I really encourage you to read this book, guys. Again, I'm going here to plug his work again. Dr. Farrell deserves some love. Every single one of his books is impeccably researched, and this one's no exception. It's only $20 on Amazon, and I really encourage you to do it, because what it then goes into is the very cases of the Bible and the research and the religious texts that we all have access to in our modern human existence, Yahweh included. It really explains how the mind control of the Hebrews was able to persist. So I'll leave that there on a little bit, of a darker note, because we're about to get into why there's a lot more hope than you would think with this book here. We're talking about, just to kind of sum up where we're at, we're going to eventually get to the end here of this video. We're going to talk about why this map of Ireland matters and why it ties in. But we've got a couple of things here to review. We've got an Earth grid structure of an expanding Earth right now, in which we're expanding at a rate quicker than at other times. I referenced Hawaii spreading apart right now and having lava flows and fissures, just like over here at this expansion joint, I'll call it. And we have several key factors with our magnetosphere weakening and a grand solar minimum beginning, and quite frankly, the sun feeding the Earth more energy than it's typically used to. So we have a point of time in which there's going to also be very active nodes along these points, and the ley lines which connect the Earth grid network, as Florida Maquis has brilliantly pointed out, are going to start coming into play, obviously, in the geopolitical environment. And as we are now starting to get into, well, there's probably more to this than we realize, because these pentagonal structures usually have something to do with these big sacred sites. We have more traditionally built ones that are built with city infrastructure, rather, and as he's talked about, DC being the parasite network. And this could be for communications, it could be travel, it could be literally capturing the energies and appropriating them for some other type of means. But that's essentially where our research has taken us to at this point in time, guys. And now we're going to talk about why it factors into the time we're in, and again, a little bit more hope. Show this picture of Nikola Tesla again. So how do I want to go about it? Here we go. I think this is the way I want to go about it. So we're talking about sacred geometry. I don't know if I can move that. I guess I can move this over here. Wonderful. And this is actually something I sniped off of Sacred Geometry International's videos. This is actually Randall Carlson's work. But the reason I snapped this because I augmented the last piece of it right here, because I'm going to tie it into Walter Cruttenden's work instead, because I can actually hypothesize here a little bit as to a piece that I think Randall Carlson's missing. And while this is a really cool chart that is worth going into in and of its own, I only reference it here because we've got some sacred geometry that we're working with, and only to show that time increments are also somehow relational to the sacred geometrical expansion event that I think is occurring here on the Earth, and has something to do, of course, I think with the 2012 Mayan calendar as it relates to these great year Yugas. He prescribes in his version that this is a 25,000 and I believe 800 some odd year cycle, and I put 24,000 as you guys saw. He's not the only one that believes that this 25,800 year cycle is the actual precession. But there's a concept that we're missing that I think harkens to our rise in spirituality right now, and how we could have ever gotten to the fall of spirituality that we did in what we call the Dark Ages. And I'll get to this in a second, but this is kind of the research website where they're tying together some concepts of the Sphinx, and among popular archaeology, I think more prescribes to the 25,800 year precessional cycle is what's measured, but there's a variable that's missing, is why this is inaccurate to Walter Cruttenden's estimation, actually. And he argues, in fact, that the calculation is off because we are not factoring in our binary star to the model of precession. And this actually has everything to do with us on the rise in terms of a consciousness. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the Yuga cycle here, but it's a concept that Sri Yukteswar in the book The Holy Science brought back to the fore at the turn of the last century, and it's actually referenced in this book as well, very reverently, in fact, by Walter Cruttenden. The Yuga cycles are very important tracking that we've lost, and goes into how these monuments in Giza are lined up to specific points on Orion's belt, and as they're associated, in fact, and the Egyptians associated with the star Sirius. Here's a picture of Sri Yukteswar, who brought this thought pattern back to the popular, believe it or not, science through a spiritual text in a very elegant way, and reintroduced this Yuga cycle to humanity. So pretty important dude to know about, and what he essentially talked about in his book is that humanity goes through these 24,000 year cycles, and he mentions even that it's a 24,000 year cycle. And some other things just to keep in mind, I'm inclined to believe, just from the symmetries of things, the 24,000, because of the 24 hours in a day, 12 hours of a clock multiplied by 2 equals 24 hours in a day. The precession of the equinox is 12 equal parts like a clock, and I think these are the calculations, of course, that the ancients used. So just looking at a matching perspective, the 25,800 year starts to come into question. But this is thusly so, irrespective of what the popular belief is in science today. Sri Yukteswar talks about this being a 24,000 year cycle, and us coming out of what's called the Kali Yuga and into the Dwapara Yuga. Each one of these represents a stage in our humanity's growth, which goes in a cycle, as you might be able to imagine. And a different look at this, you're going to start to see something maybe that you've heard before. If we're referring to these instead of yugas as ages, we get the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, the Dark Age, or the Aegean Age, and you go back up. And notice that all of the Crusades, the Christ dying on the cross, the Council of Nicaea, the witch hunts that basically took all the spirituality out of the world and destroyed a lot of what, even in the Celtic regions and who knows what else in the Middle East, is when our consciousness is very low, is essentially what this chart's telling you. And for some reason, our consciousness begins to raise through the bronze, silver, gold spectrums, and these are thousands of years cycles, right? This is the year 2000. If we're starting back at the year 0 of this cycle, around the year 2000 is where we're at. Excuse me, I've got this a little bit backwards. Of course, we're just right here. This is 1998. So we're actually just barely into the bronze cycle, but what I can tell you is what's really curious about what lines up with the bronze cycle starting right here is the Renaissance period. It's really funny how all of a sudden humanity goes into an awakening right at this jump period. So coming back to this, we start to piece together that there's some iconography happening within the sacred geometry of the universe plus this Yuga cycle concept. And what we're just about to figure out, I think, is why our brain capacity only is 10% active, when up here in the Satya Yuga, the Golden Age, we're totally connected. And I surmise that pesky remaining 90% of our brain power that we don't know how to access, in another 6,000 years' time, humanity will be back at this point. And you might be asking, okay, well, how the heck is this all happening? I'm sure that's all on your minds. And the answer is, in Walter Cruttenden's world here, in all the research he's ascribed based on this concept, it's that our planet is orbiting behind a sun who also has a binary orbit with another sun, another star, and Sirius is that star. As I mentioned, that the Egyptians had so much of an affinity for tracking in the sky with their monoliths. This is an interesting chart because it shows, if you're looking at the top down of the orbital pattern, the sun orbiting Sirius in a 24,000 year cycle. And so to explain why it would be a 24,000 year cycle versus a 25,800 year cycle, you need only factor in the slingshot effect of gravity of the sun as it approaches Sirius. They're going to reach the perihelions of the apexes of their orbits with each other, and then they're going to come crashing back toward each other at faster speeds, and then slower speed, faster speed. But it's that very speed that they catch up to each other in the Golden Age with, and pass each other by more quickly, being more closely associated in a gravitational pull. That slingshot effect, in fact, fast forwards what would normally be, without Sirius orbiting the sun, a 25,800 year process. So it's only by adding in the Sirius dual star model that you get this perfect symmetry and perfect 24,000 year precession cycle that goes through the various phases of the astrology signs and the zodiac. Excuse me. So what's interesting about this is that, just like our temple example, Walter Cruttenden starts to talk about the energies from space being something that can be captured, and in our cosmic influence of our local system here, affects us in terms of how we awaken to it. And I think most people are these days familiar with the chakra system, and how potentially some of these people that are also going to know about it might know that there's an ancient technology associated with it. And Walter Cruttenden actually goes into a lot of what makes the movement in the 60s interesting. Talks about what magnetism does in certain ways, and I actually refer you to a different person's or different YouTubers' work if you really want to get into that, and that's Ken Wheeler in terms of magnetism. But ultimately, he factors in factors back in the Megaliths that we're talking about in the next chapter of his book, in chapter 7, called The Wisdom of the Stones, and he talks about how the ancients, in times where the sun goes further away from Sirius than would allow for a conscious awakening of somebody, let's just say, they use devices to capture the remnant energy that they can and transmit it through that very Earth grid network that we've been discussing in those times. I'll show you how that works. First, we're going to go back and we're going to show probably a concept that to couple with the orbit model of Sirius. This is going to be maybe a lot to digest here, but this is going to be a video that we get by DJ Sadhu. And of course, before we start that, we're going to track the sun, of course, around the galactic plane in this galactic quote-unquote disk model, and see how this thing actually moves relative to how we're capturing energies and this whole expansion process is happening in the first place. So you might see as the video starts to zoom up here on this little dot, which is going in a corkscrew pattern about the galactic plane, you'll see kind of this terminal shock start to form on the outside. And I'll pause it here. What you're probably starting to realize is you're viewing our sun, the system of our sun, our solar system. And this, of course, is something people may be familiar with, our heliosphere on the outer edge. But what a lot of the perspective that is lost on people, in addition to the expanding Earth theory, is that rather than assuming that the rest of space is a vacuum, we can only assume that behind our sun is a vacuum. Similar to how where did I put? Oh, here, of course. Here it is. Similar to how a sonic boom behind a jet works. Sonic boom is created because the material of the jet moving about the creating resistance against pressure mediation of the O2 and the nitrogen mixture in the air, whatever the mixture is. I'm going to botch it if I sit here and try and explain what the air is composed of. But the point is that there's material there. It's not just empty space. And there's a vacuum then created when the object is going about that material quicker than it can keep up with it, due to a friction effect. You can just think of it basically like that. This is the same thing that's happening here with the sun. The stellar wind, the material, the medium out here, whatever it is composed of, similar to the air that the jet's moving about, is pressing against and creating friction against our sun. And this is a particular time where this is actually happening with a lot higher intensity than typical. And it's reducing the corona of this heliosphere layer down to the point where the corona of our sun is also letting material by and blasting our sun, or blasting our Earth from the sun with a bunch of cosmic material that it's not necessarily used to getting all at once. So our magnetosphere is compressing. The material that's getting through to create pressure in the plasma core is creating new matter, creating new structure to the oceans, and of course, again, going back to this Earth grid network expanding. That's a very energetic time, in other words, at this point. Just to come back and finish this out, though, to show you how this motion truly forms, and we can get a broader understanding. You can see how all the planets then are orbiting the sun in this helical type pattern. And helical, of course, reminds us of strand of DNA. And what are we talking about other than the helical system of the solar system, ourselves, of the sun, orbiting in this pattern, a corkscrew, to... Sorry, I can't find the graphic here, guys. I don't know where it went. Here it is. I'm so sorry about that. The DNA pattern of these two stars orbiting together in what's called a helical pattern, the true completion of the double helix. I don't think there's any coincidence that the DNA structure of our sun, if you can only imagine this video also encompassing the star Sirius into its animation. It does not put that variable in here. Brilliant animation as it is. I think it's somewhat incomplete without Walter Cruttenden's work attached to it, is all I'm saying. So if you can imagine the Sirius planet, or the Sirius, the sun of Sirius orbiting our sun, and creating this pattern where we go through these dark and light cycles of spirituality, you can kind of get the drift. So why does that function into the graphic of Ireland and the towers, right? Well, first and foremost, let's come back to this. In the book, Walter Cruttenden, in this very chapter, actually describes that there's some very curious things in certain parts of the world. And Giza is one. All of the things in the Giza Plateau, you treat the Nile River as the Milky Way, and they line up the structures, the pyramids themselves, with incredible accuracy to the night sky around the constellation Orion in Sirius. For some reason, you also have Draco outlined here in Ireland, also with incredible accuracy to the night sky's constellation. And a lot of these ones that are encircled are called the round towers. And these have particular significance because the type of structure is repeated with vast replicability over periods of time, and they look something like this. In fact, this is the Glendalough Tower, and it is located right here on our map in Eastern Ireland. It's the most complete structure to date. Most of them are torn apart, war ravaged, or whatever. But the study that's been done on this, and what Walter Cruttenden talks about in the book, in fact, is that these are channeling mechanisms. If you just look at the structure here of what's inside the pyramid at Giza, and you look at the gazebo-like structure of the Japanese gondola here, you're starting to see something that's consistent with what the cross-section of these towers in Ireland look like. And I thought that he had one of those cross-section illustrations here, but I'm pretty sure he actually just described it, I guess. But he describes that the insides of these things have conductive material, granite, aggregate in certain pieces, and what they're building is effectively antennas. And that goes back to our conclusion about what the bankers and the money changers were using in ancient times, these megalithic structures, on these nodal points for mind manipulation, but in a sense of manipulating people into a religion or a money construct to enslave them. Where there were also people on Earth, it's important to maintain that we're using these structures for a much more spiritual reason. Down here in the sarcophagus in the Giza temple, Napoleon Bonaparte was even said to have laid in this and spent the night, and had immensely hallucinogenic, psychedelic type visions of the future, of geometric shapes. Again, going back to Randall Carlson's work with the geometric shapes, right? So there's something connecting right now, these Earth grid networks that we're finding, and the Florida Maquis continues to be brilliant at discovering. But we're also just starting to find out what we can use these things for good. So I recommend that the conspiratorial side of things, everybody kind of remain, this caricature of Nikola Tesla and kind of be diligent about questioning where we're at. But I think we can also look at the future with a little bit of hope, right? And one thing I want to leave with, coming back just briefly to this graphic here. One of the things, in addition, that Sri Yukteswar was talking about in his book, The Holy Science, was that something that we have lost over time, and it's probably no surprise because we've sacked the Library of Alexandria, lost everything from those times, is that today we actually measure the demarcation line of our precession around the equinox based on the vernal equinox of the sun rising. But what we need to consider, he says, is that we were actually measuring in ancient times when the Vedics were measuring this, and they were the ones that made up this science, so why not believe them, is that the true measurement would be at the autumnal equinox. All that would mean, guys, is that due to popular belief, we aren't going into the age of Aquarius from the age of Pisces, but rather into the age of Leo, because it's just 180 degrees away on the same line. And that brings up something curious to me, because I think there's something about the Sphinx in Egypt that's a great mystery. And why was the original structure, which Robert Skoke has now researched very diligently and found out was originally there, why was this carved away? Is there a reason why they don't want us to know that we're going into the age of Leo instead of the age of Aquarius? That's kind of where one of my ponderings is right now, and I'll kind of leave it at there for now. I will